Hi, I'm Paul Hutchin, and this is a special edition of Planet Holyrood. I'm joined this week by Ross Greer, who is the MSP for the West of Scotland and also the co-leader of the Scottish Greens. Now, before we kick off, Ross, I was just looking at your age on Wikipedia. I think you're 31. So there's two ways of looking at this. Either it's very impressive to be leading a political party at such a young age, or shouldn't you be doing something more enjoyable in your early 30s?
I'm just thinking of the phrase "I was the future" once. Remember 10 years ago, people were, "Oh, the youngest ever MSP, 21." Like 31, you're really beginning to stretch it now. I mean, like I do youth work outside of politics. The actual young people that I work with think that I am ancient and completely out of touch with popular culture. But I mean, the kind of serious point on that I've always said is whether it's Parliament or Council Chamber, whatever it is, it needs to look like the society that it represents. And unless you've got people of my generation, and now younger, there's a generation after me, unless you've got folk like that in there, you're totally losing out on what that generational experience is like, particularly in areas like housing. Like the reality of trying to get on the housing ladder for folk my age, totally different to what it is for people older than us. So yeah, hopefully I've been able to bring that in, even if by the standards of parliamentary careers, I'm maybe more at the old and haggard end of things.
Who's the youngest just now?
Emma Roddick's younger than I am, so she was elected the one after me. So I was 21 in 2016. Emma was, I think I'm getting this right, 23 in 2021. So Emma's the youngest member of the parliament at the moment, and I'm the youngest who has ever been elected. Ever being a relative term because the parliament is still younger than the both of us.
So, I mean, we don't do baby the house and all of that sort of Westminster. I just wonder if it'll be the case one day that you'll have been the youngest MSP and then you're the sort of the oldest.
Oh God, I hope not. Yeah, no, somebody pointed that out to me not long after I got elected. That I could do the job for 20 years and obviously be 41 at the other end of it and have another career or multiple other careers after it. I can categorically assure you now that I will not be in Parliament long enough to be the oldest member. Not to put some of our colleagues in a position where they might want to chase me down the corridor, but Gillian Mackay, my co-leader, Gillian's slightly, roughly the same age as me, slightly older than I am. Gillian pointed out that combined, the two of us are still younger than some of our colleagues in the Parliament. Not naming any names because I don't want chased down the corridors when I'm back next week.
Would you still like to be an MSP in your 40s, 50s?
My 50s, definitely not. I mean, 40s, that would be, you'd be 20 years plus at that point. I think the key thing is to know when to quit. So one of the first people that I ran into when I got elected in 2016 was Mike Russell, the former SNP, MSP, and cabinet secretary. And Mike gave me just a brilliant one-liner bit of advice. I'd known him for years before that, but what he said at that point on day one of me in the job was, enjoy every minute of this, but when you stop enjoying it, stop doing it. I think you do need people who have a real drive. There's no point in just sitting there going through the motions when you're doing a job as important as that. There's 129 of us running the country, deciding what the law is. If you've got folk who are just passengers there, they need to take a step back and let somebody in who's got a real driving motivation to be there and to deliver something. So hopefully when I get to that point, if I don't notice, there will at least be people around me or people who've bookmarked this podcast and come back to me years later and say, this is maybe the moment for you to take that step back.
So there was another opinion poll published yesterday. It was Survation, I think commissioned by True North. In terms of the seat extrapolation, it had you up a bit, I think, to 9,
Yeah.
but it's still in 6th place in terms of positioning. Of course, there was a very small gap between 6th and 3rd place. What's your response to that, Paul?
I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm in a pretty fortunate position, relatively new co-leader of a party that myself and Gillian are looking at our worst polls being ones where we only gain 1 or 2 seats. Some of our colleagues in other parties, their worst polls are a lot worse than that. They're talking about losing 2/3 of the seats they've got. So Survation there, probably our least favourable, shows us up at either 9 or 10, depending on whose seat projection you use. That would be the most Green MSPs ever elected to Parliament. So our worst poll shows a record result. The last poll of 2025 was the Ipsos poll that had us on 17%, which would be about 17, 18 MSPs, tied with Reform and a point behind Labour. And as you say, like the reality is, for everybody other than the SNP, the rest of us are all bunching pretty close. We're all within single digits of each other here, really. So the competition between sixth place and second place is a pretty narrow one, albeit the SNP are further ahead. But for us, we're looking at a position where it's a question of how many gains can the Greens make. And I think the answer to why that's the case is pretty simple, is the people who voted for us in 2021 and 2016 even have seen us deliver on the stuff that we said we would. Free bus travel for young people, the rent controls we've just passed, they'll be coming in soon. We scrap peak fares and ScotRail. That's stuff that people can tangibly feel every day. So it's not a huge surprise, but we're very grateful that the people who voted for us last time are clearly still intending to do so. But there are more and more people who are obviously intending to do it. Our worst polls, if realised on election day, would still be a record result. They would still be the highest that a Green Party has ever achieved in an election here.
So the wild card in this election is Reform, this anti-immigration party. There's a spate of polls showing them coming second. I mean, knowing what you do about Scottish politics and just speaking to people on the streets and just feeling the anger that's there, do you think they will come second?
I think they could. There is absolutely a danger that they could, and it's why we need everybody who believes that Scotland can be a fairer and a kinder and a more welcoming place. Everybody who believes in that, everybody who believes in common decency needs to make sure that they get out and vote, and that's how we can stop that. But there's also responsibility on politicians who believe in that, folk like ourselves. People are angry, and they're right to be angry. Like, I'm not dismissing the anger that people feel, but it's not immigrants who put anybody's electricity bill up. It's not asylum seekers who put anybody's rent up. They're not the reason why the weekly shop has got so expensive. And a party led by multimillionaires is not going to solve those problems. Reform is a party led by and bankrolled by the people causing these problems in the first place. The people that are making everybody else's life so hard right now are multimillionaires and billionaires. It's tax avoiders, it's greedy landlords. I think the key role for the Greens to play in this election is to point that out. There are other parties, and I will credit the First Minister here. He has been absolutely rock solid on the core moral value stuff when it comes to Scotland being a welcoming country. I saw him do a photo call with children from our Afghan community recently, and I appreciated living in a country where the First Minister is willing to do that. It's hard to see Keir Starmer being as relaxed in those kind of settings, but people need to know that the problems are going to be solved. And to solve the problems that people are facing in their lives, we need to be honest about who's responsible. That's what I don't see from the SNP. They're not going to go after the greedy landlords, the billionaires, the tax avoiders. The Greens are the party saying, no, these are the people who are at fault. We're going to make them pay to fix the problems that they've caused. And that's how your lives are going to get better. We have increased taxes on the wealthy and on the very, very, very wealthy. We've used that money to deliver policies like free bus travel for young people, scrapping peak rail fares, and we want to do even more of that. That's how you tackle reform. We don't tackle reform by spending all of our time talking about them and in practice legitimising the really kind of hateful, toxic, and ultimately misleading politics that they're pushing.
I think this is going to be the most bitter and the nastiest Holyrood election campaign that we've seen.
If I was betting on it now, yeah. Scottish politics has, over the last 10 to 15 years, definitely got worse and more divisive. And it's because there are some people who are actively trying to make that the case. It works in their favour. And it's not just Reform. So Reform are at the moment the worst example of this. Like, they're really trying to stir up as much tension as they can. Nigel Farage spends a lot of his time attacking Glaswegian school children at the moment, which is creepy apart from anything else. Not only has he said it, but they've put it in their leaflets as well. But Reform aren't the only ones doing this. I've been in Parliament now for long enough to see the behaviour of the Tory party change dramatically. They were never the good guys. They were never part of a broad consensus to build a better Scotland, right? The Tories are the bad guys of Scottish politics. But the way that they behave now isn't just designed to stop us from doing things that take this country forward. They're actively trying to basically bring the house down around them. They're trying to make it so difficult and so toxic and so nasty to get anything done that nobody even tries. And then hope disappears. Now, for them, I think it's simple. If they make the Scottish Parliament look like a place where there's no hope that things will get better, it's pretty hard to believe that we'd be capable of independence. So for them, it's a constitutional strategy. For us, that's why it does come back to hope. We just need people to believe again. We need to give people the confidence. We need to give them the reason to believe that things can actually get better in their lives and that we are collectively capable of making things better. So hope needs to be the word that we use to counter the hate that other people are bringing in, rather than just constantly talking about them and their hateful politics.
I mean, you mentioned the word kind or kindness earlier. Doesn't feel like politics and society is becoming kinder at this moment in time.
No, and again, I think it's because it's to the benefit of certain forces in our politics. You know, that if people are divided against each other, if ordinary people are divided against each other on the basis of the color of their skin or the country they were born in or who they love or their religion, then it lets the people who are actually at fault off the hook. If ordinary people are all divided against each other, the greedy landlords, the billionaires, the tax avoiders can get away with continuing to exploit everybody. It is not a coincidence that the people bankrolling reform are these very same people. It is the super rich. You know, they've just got that £9 million donation, I think, from somebody involved in crypto who's based in Thailand. You know, these are not people who are making society better. They're people who don't want us to make society better. It would go against their interests. The people who are sitting on mountains of wealth that they couldn't spend in 1,000 lifetimes don't want people in Scotland or across the UK to believe that things can get better. Because for things to get better for everybody else, we would have to start by having a reckoning with the fact that this tiny group of people have stolen so much wealth from the rest of the country and that people are really suffering as a result of that. So that's something that we need to bring into this conversation more of, you know, whose interests does it serve? For example, for Farage to be attacking Glaswegian school children because, God forbid, they can speak more languages than just English. Whose interest does that serve? That's not in the interest of the other kids in Glasgow who can only speak English. It's not in the interest of ordinary Glaswegians, regardless of where they come from, whether they were born here or elsewhere. No, that kind of divisive politics is in the interest of the super rich because it takes attention away from them and all the problems that they've caused.
So let's just go back to the leadership contest, following which you were elected co-leader. You were very clear, because I remember I interviewed you in Glasgow, that you felt like the best way of getting green policies implemented was to be in government. So that is your preference,
Yeah.
you know, on ballot. You would prefer to be in government than on the backbenches. So let's imagine, you know, we have the election in May. There's maybe the SNP on 60 seats. You guys are on like 10, 11, something like that. How likely is it, do you think, that the SNP and the Greens will strike a deal that will see you go back into government?
It's hard to put odds on it. And ultimately, you know, as is rightly the case in a situation like that, it's the party who comes first in the election that has the first right to try and form a government. So it would be in that scenario, initially John Swinney's decision about how he wants to proceed. So if you look at 2016, Nicola Sturgeon, immediately the day after the election, the day the votes were counted, said, we will proceed as a minority government. So that was when the SNP lost the single party majority. She decided in 2016 minority government would work, and that on a case-by-case basis they would work with the Greens or with other parties. So we worked with the SNP to advance progressive causes. Occasionally they worked with the Conservatives to stop progressive things happening in areas like land reform. 2021, it was different. That was because Nicola Sturgeon decided that she wanted a stable majority government because that's how you can get a lot more done. And she came and spoke to us. From my personal perspective, and as personal, we as a party would need to make a collective decision on that. But clearly you get more done when you're in government than in opposition. If it was the case you could get just as much done from opposition, nobody would ever want to be the government because governments get blamed for everything, the stuff they're at fault for and the stuff that's not their fault. Nobody would want to be in government if you could achieve your own aims from opposition. And I think we have a moral obligation. You know, if we believe that society can be far fairer. You know, we've constantly said this is one of the richest countries in the history of the world. There's no reason why tens of thousands of children woke up hungry in Scotland this morning, but they did, and we can solve that. If we believe we can solve that, surely we have a moral obligation to seize the opportunity to try. On the climate, amplify that by 1,000. We've only got a few years left to tackle the climate emergency before the planet hits its tipping point, basically. Surely we should seize any opportunity in that period to prevent that, to protect the planet, to tackle the climate emergency. What I've said all along, though, is there's no point in going into government to deliver somebody else's agenda. If we were confident that we could deliver green policies, deliver the things people elected us to do, I think we don't really seriously at it. It would be a collective decision for our whole party to make. But in any situation like that, if I'd been given a mandate to negotiate, my job would be to get as much green policy delivered as possible. That's how we've already delivered things like free bus travel. So, you know, even from opposition negotiating on this budget, we went in saying to the government, we want more free school meals and more childcare. So we came to an agreement to roll out these universal breakfast clubs in primary school, because that ticks both of those boxes. It's a free meal and it's wraparound childcare before the school day starts. The job of politicians should be to deliver on the agenda we were elected for. There's quite a contrast in Parliament at the moment between those of us who are grabbing at every opportunity to deliver the things we believe in, and others who are just trying to burn the place down. And if another party says black, they say white.
So, I mean, here's the thing. So John Swinney took over in sort of ashes of Humza Yousaf's administration. He took over at a very low ebb. He steadied the ship despite a terrible general election result, and they're now 20 points ahead in the opinion polls. You know, he got his first budget through. Clearly, he's going to get a second budget through. Won't John Swinney just come to the conclusion that he doesn't need a partner in government, that he's got the skills to be able to run a minority administration with good relations with the Greens, but not actually bringing you into government?
A good question to put to John Swinney, because that'll be his decision to make. My job is to get as many Greens elected as possible, because with more Green MSPs, we will have more leverage and we can deliver more policies that save people money and protect the planet. In that scenario, though, the other thing to weigh up is what the dynamic is going to be in the Parliament overall. So a big part of the reason why Nicola invited us in 2021 was because in the 18 months leading up to that election, the Parliament got so toxic, and the opposition, the unionist opposition, I mean, so not including the Greens, was just seizing on every opportunity to try and bring the government down. Ultimately, essentially, there were repeated attempts to destroy Nicola Sturgeon over the conduct of Alex Salmond. So to destroy a woman over the conduct of a man. Without getting into the specifics of that, part of the calculation from Nicola was that having a stable majority government took the kind of the daily risk out of Parliament, where it was so hard to get legislation through, it was so hard to actually deliver for the people of the country, because Parliament was becoming so engrossed in palace intrigue politics and the kind of politics of pure party advantage. If we're looking after this election at a Parliament that has a dozen or more reform MSPs in it, a far reduced but utterly radicalised Tory group, a Labour Party that has lost all sense of direction, in that scenario, if you have a Parliament that is going to frankly just be an ugly circus, and where that really toxic behaviour just gets worse and worse and worse, there is an incentive to have a majority rather than a minority government, because it means that all your focus is on delivering your agenda rather than fighting for the survival of your government every day. It means your focus is on the public rather than on politics. That's the incentive to a majority government. And in that scenario, it's the incentive to have an agreement between multiple parties to form a majority.
Do you think there are SNP cabinet secretaries and SNP ministers who would like to see another deal with the Greens?
I mean, there are a lot of SNP ministers who are strongly in favour of the agreement. You just need to look back at Twitter in the hours before Humza decided to blow it up, and you had multiple SNP government ministers tweeting about the value of that agreement, because they were trying to appeal to the members of my party who at that point were saying that we should pull out. They were trying to appeal to them and say, no, there's much more that we can achieve together. So I don't think any of the folk who were saying that back in 2023 and 24 have changed their mind on it.
So you think there'll be some support in the SNP government for another deal?
Absolutely. Nobody who was of that view in 2024 has said anything different since then, because apart from anything else, for them, it was a majority in pro-independence government. So that is the reason the SNP exists, and it's a policy that the Greens are strongly committed to, achieving our independence in the EU. It was a stable majority government. But from the perspective of government ministers, that majority thing was absolutely key. It meant that they could spend all of their time productively delivering in whatever their part of the government was, rather than spending a huge amount of their time dealing with the drama in Parliament of votes constantly being called on whatever the issue that was being grabbed out the headlines that day was. Parliament is important, there should be votes on key issues. But basically, a majority government allows you to spend much more time focused on the public policy, on delivering for the public, and less time on party politics. I think that was a big part of the appeal. But also, the reality here is there are a lot of people in the SNP, because it's a broad church, who lean to the left of what the party's programme actually is. And that goes right up to government ministers. Plenty of them would rather see an SNP that was a bit further to the left, a bit more progressive. And when the Greens were there, that's what we were doing. We could work really effectively with essentially the left, the progressive wing of the SNP, to deliver policies that made Scotland fairer and made it greener. We were able to work together to deliver policies that lifted more children out of poverty, that increased taxes more on the very wealthy to deliver those programmes to lift those kids out of poverty. The counterweight to that, obviously, is the SNP has a right wing. I'm not saying those people are on the right of politics, but they're on the right of the SNP's kind of internal political spectrum. I think folk on the left in the SNP very much enjoyed the fact that as part of a majority government, they had the Greens there as well, who were also pushing the government to deliver things like rent controls. You know, something that I think SNP Party Conference had voted for rent controls, but the government had previously rejected it. They'd repeatedly rejected it when the Greens proposed it. Then we negotiated an agreement together in government. We delivered rent controls. We delivered that emergency rent freeze. I have friends who would have been homeless in 2023. Their landlord was trying to evict them, but they couldn't do it because we delivered that emergency eviction ban and then the emergency rent freeze that came with it. That's the stuff that really matters to people. It's also something that a lot of SNP members, including elected members, including ministers, really want to do. But in a lot of cases, we're not able to get that over the line unless the Greens were in government with them.
So you're one of the architects of the original Bute House Agreement. You had ministers, you had Patrick Harvey, Lorna Slater. Humza Yousaf basically unceremoniously dumped you guys from the government. It wasn't just that, it was a humiliation. They hauled Patrick and Lorna into Bute House in full view of the cameras. And it was like not quite a public execution, but it was a sort of public firing. I mean, my question would be, how could you trust the SNP again after that?
So a couple of things. First is that it was an attempted humiliation. I think in that scenario where there were no real winners, I don't think the Greens were the ones who came off the worst there. Humza unfortunately created a situation where someone had to be the loser, and that was his choice and his choice alone. Unfortunately, the reality of the arithmetic in Parliament meant that we had the trump card. He ended a confidence agreement, so we ended our confidence in him, and we all know how that played out within a couple of hours. But what he then did was take full personal responsibility for that. And I'll always credit him with that, because at the same time, you had a Welsh First Minister, Vaughan Gethings, mired in controversy, who would not take responsibility for his own behaviour and had to be dragged out of office. So for all, Humza threw my party out of government, he made a catastrophic mistake and he then took full responsibility for it. So I acknowledge that. But there's also an element of, look, we are different parties for a reason. The Greens and the SNP don't believe in exactly the same thing. But as Greens, we believe that we should be cooperating wherever that is possible. I am not interested in waiting until it's a majority Green government before I can actually deliver on the things I care about. I care about lifting children out of poverty. I care about tackling the climate emergency. I care about securing Scotland's independence. And I want to do all of those things right now. So, I'm never going to trust the SNP as much as I trust my own colleagues in the Greens. But we all have a responsibility to find a way to work together in the interest of the people of this country. And if there are opportunities to do that in the future, whether it is in government together or with them as the government, us in opposition, negotiating on an issue-by-issue basis, I think that is at the core of what our job is supposed to be. We are here to deliver for people. And if I just turned around and said, sorry, don't trust you, is not interested in working with you, that's a different way of saying I have no interest in actually delivering the policies that I was elected to deliver.
Yeah, so you said during the contest that in principle you would like to be back in government, but you wouldn't be able to do it if Kate Forbes was the SNP First Minister, given the political differences you've got. Would you be able to share power with the SNP if they're led by Stephen Flynn?
So Stephen Flynn and I obviously have really, really significant difference of opinion when it comes to oil and gas, right? I would say that Stephen Flynn, it aligns himself with the oil and gas companies who have extracted billions of pounds of profit from Scotland, and the people of Scotland have got very, very little as a result of that. But there's also just the raw reality of climate science here. If we want to tackle the climate emergency, clearly we need to transition away from oil and gas and towards renewables as quickly as possible. That means creating new jobs in these new industries. That's not position that Stephen Flynn has. He has argued against the windfall tax on oil and gas companies. I think it's only fair that these massively profitable companies have to pay back to the country, given the amount of profit they've extracted from it. The flip side of that is, on an issue like Palestine, I think you would really struggle to find a significant difference between where I'm at and where Stephen's been on that, because it's pretty clear that a genocide has happened, a genocide continues to happen, and we have resolutely called it out and demanded the UK government do something about it. I think all of us, though, are waiting to learn more about what it is he actually believes in when it comes to domestic devolved issues in Scotland. This is not me having a go at him or his performance. It is, in a lot of ways, a much easier job to be the leader of an opposition group at Westminster, where the key job is to stand up at PMQs every week and give the Prime Minister a hard time. It's a lot easier to do that than to be a minister in the Scottish Government where you are the one making decisions and where you are responsible. And because Stephen has been an MP at Westminster in an entirely oppositional space, I, and a lot of us, I still don't really know enough about what it is he believes on issues of health, education, the devolved stuff in relation to the environment and energy. On a kind of personal curiosity level, I would definitely want to know more about that.
On climate, though, that's such a fundamental issue for you, given his position on North Sea oil, which seems to be drill, baby, drill, and he doesn't want windfall taxes. Wouldn't you find it hard to share power or something like that?
Hard, absolutely. That is an issue that could not be more important, the survival of our species on this planet. We used to talk about tackling the climate emergency as something that we would do for my generation's grandchildren, and then it became about our children. And now we, I think, can all acknowledge climate breakdown is happening now. We're watching it happen. People across the board are dying, but people in Scotland are also being hit by this. Flash flooding, wildfires are becoming way more common here. There's no way that the Greens could work with the SNP if they continue to backslide on climate. And that is one of the biggest differences we've seen since our coalition government ended. When the Greens and the SNP were in government together, the Scottish government opposed the Rosebank oil field, the application to set up a new oil field in the North Sea. When we were in government together, the Scottish government had a position against any new oil and gas developments, a presumption against. It was a government that was taking more action to tackle the climate emergency. As soon as the Greens left, the SNP started to ditch a lot of that. Now, you could say that is an argument that, you can't possibly trust these guys, don't work with them again. The flip side of it is the only way that we can get the Scottish government to tackle the climate emergency is by having Greens in government. The only way that we can shift their position, whether they is the Scottish government or the SNP as a party, is by having Greens in that position of critical influence. We achieve a lot from opposition as the Green Group, far more than the Labour Party. Labour are actively not trying to achieve anything. We are trying to get whatever we can from our manifesto delivered because it's what voters elected us to do. Clearly, you can do more of that from government, but from opposition or from government, the Greens are always going to push to expand and to escalate action to tackle the climate emergency. So if the offer that was put to us was, yeah, fine, you can come and join us in the government, but it's going to be a government that's going to go all in on the drill, baby, drill position, get as much oil and gas as we can out of the North Sea, and to hell with the future of life on this planet. Clearly, that's not going to happen. Also, John Swinney is no fool. John Swinney is a really skilled politician. He's not going to make that offer to the Greens of all parties. He knows us well enough.
Have you had any informal discussions with Swinney or cabinet secretaries about possibility of a second deal?
No, not about what happens after the election. I mean, we're colleagues who work in the same building. We have informal conversations. Most of them recently have been about what did you watch over Christmas. The most detailed conversations I've had with any cabinet secretary in the last fortnight have been about Stranger Things and our kind of comparative reviews of that. But we're not at the point of talking about what would happen after the election. And to be fair, before 2021, there weren't any discussions about that either. We started seeing stories appearing in the press that the SNP were thinking about inviting the Greens into government. We thought that was kite flying by a couple of ministers who were actually standing down and just wanted to fly their own kind of personal scenarios. We hadn't realised it was in fact something that Nicola was actively thinking about. So it's not a conversation that I expect to have before the election. And to be honest, my job between now and then is to get as many Greens elected as possible. My job in the next 10 weeks before Parliament stops for the election is to deliver as much of our agenda from this session as we can. We were elected on a manifesto in 2021. We've still got 21 bills to go through Parliament in the next 10 weeks, something like that. That's a huge range of opportunities for us to deliver more green policies that will save people money, protect the planet, lift kids out of poverty. That's what I'm focused on right now. And who forms the government after the election is a conversation for after the election.
So just on independence, the SNP's new position is that they're pushing for an outright majority of MSPs. They see that is the mandate, nothing else for IndyRef 2. How do you see it?
I mean, that's a daft position. And it's clearly a position that's designed to get the SNP re-elected rather than advance the case for independence. Is the First Minister really suggesting that if we yet again elect a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, that it would lack legitimacy because it was made up of the SNP and the Greens? That every single poll shows that there's going to be another pro-independence majority, but only because of Green MSPs. There hasn't been a poll yet that I can recall that's had an SNP outright majority. If there has, it's maybe been one out of dozens. So you're talking a 99% probability of a pro-independence majority because of the Greens.
What are the percentage chances of an outright SNP majority, do you think?
Less than 1% probably does feel about right for it. I mean, it's the job of the SNP to argue why they think they can get one. It's the job of political commentators and analysts to look at the numbers here. But from my perspective, I find it very hard looking at the last few constituencies that they would need to win to get to 65. Frankly, I just can't see it. But more importantly, it shouldn't need that. It's not for us to tell voters that the votes for some pro-independence parties count more than others, or the votes for some anti-independence parties count for more than others. Anybody voting for the SNP or the Greens is voting for an independent Scotland in the European Union, and anybody voting for Labour, Tory, Lib Dem reform is voting against independence. That's clear. That's what all of our parties stand for. It's not for us to redefine each other's position or to tell voters what they think.
If he goes into that election sticking with this position, and when the votes are counted, there is a pro-independence majority, but not a majority for the SNP, would you accept that he will have shot himself in the foot because he's made such a song and dance about there has to be an SNP majority, then the mandate for IndyRef 2 will not exist?
The mandate for it will exist because every vote for the Greens will be a vote for a pro-independence majority, and it's not for it's not for the leader of any other party to say, no, actually, that's not what you voted for.
What credibility would he have, though?
So there's a difference between the SNP's credibility in that scenario and the mandate for independence. So if voters have decided to elect a pro-independence majority, then that is the mandate that we have from the public. The fact that the SNP have undermined that majority before the votes are even counted is something that they're going to have to own and that they're going to have to deal with. But for the Greens, in that scenario, which is the scenario that 99% of the polls are pointing towards, we will be pretty clear. That's a mandate for us to push for independence. I think, though, that the key thing on the independence argument is that we need to stop talking about process and start talking to people about why independence would actually improve their lives and why it's what we need. Things at the moment that people are really struggling with, like energy bills. That's exactly why we should be talking about independence. The Scottish Government cannot reduce people's energy bills. That's not a devolved power, it's reserved. If that power was here in this massively energy-rich country, we could absolutely cut people's bills. Because for a start, electricity generated from renewables, far cheaper than electricity generated from fossil fuel sources, i.e. gas-fired power stations. So we have the opportunity to cut people's energy bills if Scotland's independent. That's what I want to be talking about, rather than endless arguments about process and mandate. As far as I'm concerned, that's a simple one. If voters elect a majority independence parliament, that is a mandate for us to push towards independence. And if they don't, it's not. In a scenario where there's a pro-union majority, I will still believe in independence. I'll still want to persuade people of it, but I'll recognise that we're not going to become independent in the lifetime of a parliament that has a pro-union and anti-independence majority. I'm just asking politicians of all parties to respect the voters and what they actually choose, rather than us constantly trying to tell voters from other parties, oh no, that's not what you actually voted for, and you therefore don't get it.
Do you think the SNP will change or modify that policy in the run-up to the election?
They've backed themselves into a corner. on this one, certainly. Part of it is because they've got themselves stuck feeling like they have to talk about process. And that's the issue. The way I want the SNP to get out of that corner they backed themselves into, because I want them to work with us to advance the cause of independence, is to say, look, process is not what we should be talking about. We should be talking about the ways that with independence, we can help people save money, lift kids out of poverty, improve the standard of living, protect the planet, be a force for peace in the world. At the moment, we're going back into an era of great powers in the world, right at the point where the UK has just cut itself off from the most stable, reliable, democratic power bloc, which is the European Union. That, to me, is something that we could be really getting the public excited about again. Say, with independence, Scotland can rejoin the EU, and we will have the protection of being part of what is, yes, a global superpower. The EU is a superpower. Britain is not. We would not have to be reliant on an increasingly unstable US government. We would be far more protected from other aggressive powers like Russia. That's the kind of stuff I want to talk about. I want to talk about my vision for an independent Scotland, how it would benefit people individually, as families, as communities, but how we as a country could be a force for good in the world. I want the SNP to also be talking about that. As someone who wants independence, I want the SNP and the Greens to both be effective at growing support for it. Getting lost in discussions about what the process of achieving a referendum is or mandates, that, frankly, is what the anti-independence forces want us to do, because all the time we spend on that is time that we have not spent persuading people why Scotland should be an independent country.
It strikes me that, I think you said that they backed themselves into a corner. If we do end up with another pro-independence majority, but the SNP have been elected on this policy, are they not going to need a new leader in order to sort of, change their position? Because there would be a real credibility issue if John Swinney was to turn around on May the 8th and say, oh, well, I've changed my mind. We do have a mandate because the Greens are with us.
I mean, it's for the SNP to choose who their leader is. I remember the 2023 leadership election for them when Nicola stood down, and everybody was desperately trying to get the Greens to say who we wanted to win. It was quite obvious that we preferred Hamza to Kate, but we really didn't want to be seen to be telling the members of another party who they should elect, in the same way that I wouldn't have appreciated SNP members telling my members who to vote for in the leadership election we've just had. In that scenario, though, again, our position is going to be, it's for the SNP who leads them. But if the voters have just chosen a pro-independence majority, then that's the mandate. Where we don't question or try and reinterpret what people voted for. If they vote for the SNP, they've clearly voted for a pro-independence party. If they vote for the Greens, they've clearly voted for a pro-independence party. That's the mandate. But frankly, we should be far, far more focused on getting people convinced of the merits of independence itself. Polling at the moment on independence is 50-50, right? I think the average of polls in 2025 shows a lead for yes of less than 1%. So a statistical tie. I want to keep growing support for independence because rather than continue to argue over whether parliamentary majorities are enough of the mandate or not, that all becomes kind of moot if we're all just obviously looking at a situation where 55, 60% or more of the public every time they're polled on independence itself say, yes, I want Scotland to be an independent country. That's what we should be focusing on. And getting lost in the discussions about mandates, I think, is the SNP frankly playing into Westminster's hands. And yeah, that is something that they're going to have to explain and that they're going to have to defend. From my perspective, it's quite simple. A vote for the Greens is a vote for an independent Scotland in Europe. We are going to do everything we can to build support for independence. That's the way that we achieve it, not getting lost in more arguments about process.
A few final questions. So you were interviewed recently by Nick Robinson, and the Isla Bryson issue came up multiple times. I think you were asked whether you believe Isla Bryson to be a man or a woman. Now, you and I would both agree Isla Bryson is a rapist. Why do you balk at calling Isla Bryson a man?
So I don't balk at it. I reject the premise of it because that question is only ever really designed to call into question the legitimacy of all trans people. So we would not, I think, finally, we've got ourselves to the point as a society where we wouldn't be debating whether all Muslims deserved rights or all Jews deserved rights or all disabled people or all black people deserved rights based on the actions of individual criminals. And yet, that is still an acceptable way to talk about trans people. So the reason that I reject the premise of that question, apart from the fact it just reeked of Nick Robinson having not been to Scotland for 18 months and just reopened the tabs from his computer the last time he was up here and just resurrecting that story, is that I'm sitting here thinking of the parents who've come and spoken to me because they are afraid to send their trans children to school at the moment. I think of my trans friends who have been working from home for months because they're afraid to go into the office because they don't know what toilet they're actually allowed to use, or they're afraid of just being harassed in public. I think of the trans people in my life whose own lives have basically reduced to the inside of their front door because the outside world has become such a scary, such a profoundly unsafe place for them. And I refuse to indulge in conversations that again and again and again are just designed to delegitimize and humiliate all of them. In that specific case, what we're talking about is a situation that is for the prison authorities to make a decision on. They make decisions about individual risk assessment, the risk that an individual prisoner poses to other prisoners and vice versa, the risk posed to them by the rest of the prison population. The reason I reject the whole premise of it is these questions are just designed to humiliate and delegitimize all trans people in a way that we just...
Isn't it fair, though, to make a distinction between the overwhelming majority of law-abiding people, whether they're trans or not, and sex offenders? And, Isla Bryson lied about the rapes. Why would we give that person the benefit of the doubt in terms of their gender when they're a proven liar? And shouldn't there be... if you go to prison, you lose some of your rights. Your right to liberty, in many cases, your right to vote. Why should we believe Isla Bryson when he says that she's a woman?
For start, I'm not saying believe Isla Bryson. I don't know this person, wasn't obviously in the room for the court case, so I'm not talking about those individual circumstances, because I think you're talking about individual circumstances when you don't know them is usually a mistake for politicians to make. I think far too often politicians weigh in on court cases, employment tribunals, etc.
We'll come to that, don't worry.
Yeah, when they and we shouldn't. What I'm talking about is my frustration that, frankly, I cannot remember the last time I have been asked to talk about whether trans people deserve rights or not in the context of anything other than these kind of individual cases like that. It just doesn't happen when we're talking about whether, as I said, Jews or Muslims or black people or disabled people or other marginalized groups, other minority groups collectively deserve rights. And what really upsets me about the whole conversation is that trans people themselves are almost never part of this conversation. I constantly see the rights, not just the rights, the existence of trans people, whether the existence of trans people is legitimate or not, I see being debated constantly. And there is almost never the voice of a trans person there saying, here's who I am, this is my life, I just want to be able to get on with it and live it. So yeah, I, more often than not, reject the premise of the way that this is often put to me, because I think I cannot stop thinking about the trans people I know in my life and the trans constituents I've got, and that the harm that has been done to them, to the point where a lot of them, I am not joking, are afraid to leave their house now. I hate the fact that there are people in this country who are afraid to leave the house because their very existence has been called into question. And the only way they ever hear other people talk about them is in the context of, at this point in time, a rapist.
You mentioned the Sandy Peggy case. Obviously, she partially won her employment tribunal against NHS Fife. Do you consider her to be a hero?
No, absolutely not. I think it's not helpful for anyone involved in an employment tribunal for it to become a political and media circus. I think that was unhelpful for her. It was unhelpful for Beth Upton, the doctor. And by the way, Beth Upton completely and utterly exonerated in that situation. Sandy Peggy was not completely and utterly exonerated. I want to be careful about what I say, because I don't think politicians should be weighing in to the extent many have in this case. But the things that she was found to have said, which were grossly offensive, are something that I can't get out of my mind, but also her reliability in that situation. I think by and large, though, again, not knowing either of the people involved, my presumption is that neither Sandy Peggy nor Beth Upton wanted this to become this national circus in the way that it did. And I don't think it has been good for anybody involved in that situation, but I do keep coming back to the fact that Beth Upton, the doctor here, was dragged through this whole process. Horrible accusations were made of her. Her private life was invaded constantly. Her face was plastered all over the place. And in the end, the conclusion was she had absolutely no case to answer. She had done nothing wrong. She was a doctor who was just trying to care for her patients. And for no other reason than being trans, her life has basically been ruined by this situation. So let's imagine that for no other reason than being Jewish, someone had been dragged through that same situation. I think we would all acknowledge how outrageously, utterly unacceptable that was, or if someone had been dragged through it because they're black or disabled. I'm not saying that everybody in these groups lives a perfect life now. There's still horrible inequalities in our society. But Beth Upton's life was all but destroyed, turned completely upside down for no other reason than being trans. And she was just trying to do her job to serve her patients and treat them and make sure that they get the best quality of care. That's what really upsets me about that whole situation.
Final question, Zach Polanski. Now, I think a lot of voters will not realise that the Scottish Green Party and the Green Party are separate. They probably just think they're one and the same.
Yeah.
Now, given that Polanski is doing so well in the polls, are you going to be using him in the Holyrood election campaign?
I'm really grateful for just how well Zach's done. So Zach and I were friends before either of us were leaders of our parties, as you say, totally separate parties. We separated in 1990, not because we fell out, but because Greens believe in local decision-making and Scottish independence. So it made sense for a separate Scottish party. And I think you look at the problems that the Scottish Labour Party have had being attached to the UK Labour Party, I think clearly we made the right decision on that all those decades ago. But what I'm really grateful for with Zach is that he is an incredibly clear and effective communicator. And he doesn't accept the nonsense premise of a lot of the questions that are put to him. He is absolutely relentless in his focus and saying the job of Greens is to take on the rich and powerful, to end inequalities, save people money, protect the planet. And the reality of UK media is a huge number of voters in Scotland between now and May are going to see Zach on their TV and in their newspapers an awful lot because he lives in London and he leads an English party and our media is very slanted towards that. So the short answer is, yeah, Zach is going to be a huge asset to the Scottish Greens in the lead up to May. Whether that's proactive or not, the reality is people in Scotland...
Would you expect to see him on the campaign trail for you?
We're looking at that at the moment. Yeah, we're looking at whether diaries are going to work out for that. He's obviously got massive elections in Wales. He's the leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. And we had a poll this week, actually, a YouGov poll in Wales that had the Greens ahead of Labour. Labour have not lost an election in Wales in democratic history in 100 years since everybody had the right to vote. We've never elected anyone to the Welsh Parliament. And that YouGov poll is not the first to show Greens getting elected to the Welsh Parliament, but this one showed us in third. Plaid winning the election, then Reform, then the Greens, and then Labour. So Zach's got massive elections in Wales, in London, elsewhere. But if we can get him up to Scotland, he would clearly be a huge asset for the campaign because, frankly, he doesn't tolerate bullshit, and I think people really like that.
How hard did you laugh when you watched the clips of your party conference? I rarely pay so much attention to the conference of other political parties, and yeah, it would be really easy to dunk on them, right? I honestly, alongside that, feel a real sense of sadness for a lot of people that I know who are good people who want to make this country a fairer place, are committed to socialist politics, and who've got involved in that, thinking it could be a vehicle that would make this country better and fairer, and it is dead on arrival because of the egos of a few individuals and the classic personality faults of certain people on the ultra left. That whole, whatever you want to call it, saga, to me just demonstrates pretty clearly, if you're on the left, if you believe in socialist politics, if you want to get socialists elected, it's the Greens. Whether it's the Scottish Greens or the Green Party of England and Wales, we are the only force on the radical left that actually gets people elected and then delivers. So if you want to tax the super rich, if you want to tackle the climate emergency, if you want to lift kids out of poverty, join the party that's doing all that stuff. We're on the cusp. In Wales, we could beat the Labour Party. In Scotland, we could beat Labour. That Ipsos poll last month had us 1 point behind them. If you want to do that, if you want to
replace Labour with a force that is genuinely trying to deliver progressive change in this country, join the Greens. Like, to me,
actually, you don't strike me as a gambling man, so let's have a prediction instead. What's your prediction for the number of seats that the Greens are going to win?
15. I genuinely think that there's an opportunity.
Which place would that? Third, fourth?
In that scenario, you're talking anywhere between second and fourth. The reality is everybody other than the SNP, it looks like, is going to be really tightly bunched, and there's only going to be a couple of seats separating us.
So you're predicting that you'll come ahead of the Tories?
Yeah, at this point in time, looking at the internal data that we've got, having been out knocking on lots of doors myself, as well as the polling, I think we are on track to beat the Tories and Labour. I think beating Reform is going to be a harder challenge for us. And there's a real challenge for us there to motivate our voters and to say, look, if you want to beat Reform, if you want to make sure that Reform are not the official opposition in the Scottish Parliament, technically that's not a thing, but they're not the biggest opposition party, vote Green, because every seat that we get elected, that's one less for them. But yeah, looking at everything that I can see, our internal data, etc., I think we are on track to have the Scottish Greens beat the Tories and Labour.
Okay, well, we hope you come into Planet Holyrood again before the election, and then after, we'll see if you get that deal with John Swinney. All right?
Thanks, Paul.
So thanks very much to Ross for joining me, and thanks also to Daryl from the Records video team who produced this episode. You can listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.